And take it away, Junius.
Okay. Hey everybody. My talk is relatively short. I wanted to leave a lot of time for discussion, and in the discussion time, we can really kind of go wherever you want. If you want to ask me more questions about my journey, and you want to hear me explain some more of kind of my institution, as you will, that's fine. If you want to ask about, if you want to bring your story into conversation with it, that's fine. If you want to start talking about, resources or advice or things like that for folks who are in various stages of this journey, that's also fine. Pretty much, nothing is off limits. I mean, let's not get personal, but I just want to have a lot of time for us to actually really be able to interact over stuff. So what I'm going to do is tee up some things that I hope will catch your interest and will be conducive to a good conversation. And also just kind of, this paper for me serves as a reflection on how I got here. Just kind of trying to put down in words some of the things that were important about how I got here at this particular moment of my life. And what's maybe something that's changed in the last several years for me is that during the pandemic, my wife and I moved to Memphis, Tennessee. I was born in Louisville, Kentucky, which is technically the South, but barely. And then so I grew up there, and then I went to college at Oral Roberts University in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And then from there I went to graduate school at Yale, and I stayed in New Haven for 16 years, so up in Connecticut. And then I went down to Baylor in Texas, and Texas is, geographically South, but it's its own culture. It's really not Southern. And then we moved here from there. And one of the things that I've experienced since I'm just thinking about my location as a Black man who is a scholar differently since moving to Memphis, because Memphis is such an incredibly racist town and there's so much tension going on here about that. And so looking back on this story, it looks a little different. I tell the story to myself a little differently than I did before I had lived in Memphis for a while. And so that's coming out in what I'm going to do here. So that's enough prologue. I'll just dive into it. I was born quite prosaically into a family of indifferent readers. My mother, father, and older brother all liked to read, but not with any sort of intentionality or coherence. My mother read mostly romance novels, but she would also read other sorts of stories. My father had read a lot in his youth and even done some theological study, but he had read hardly any of the classics. And by the time I came on the scene, he spent too much time hustling to make ends meet, often running interference with his own efforts, to slow down over a book. My brother had a good appetite for books, and I distinctly remember him reading the Odyssey for a school assignment with gusto. He would tell me about the things that he was reading in it, and it's funny because some of the things that I remember him telling me about the Odyssey, I couldn't find. I mean, I couldn't find him in the Odyssey when I got to reading it later, so I'm not sure how accurate his report was, but he was into it. But his social priorities drew him away from following this up with any real seriousness. And there was always something a little too restless in him to become really, really well read. All of their reading was traditionless and haphazard. Well, so much for them as readers. They also approached the world with a chip on their shoulders. My father, who had been the oldest child in his family not allowed to go to DC for the Million Man March, saw the world through the dual lenses of race and money, and his own disadvantages with regard to each. My mother, who looked white, protested strongly that she wasn't, which I found confusing. It felt as if she thought it would be bad to be white, but I didn't see that it would be. I found the emphasis on race in my family strange. My brother was in step with our parents. There was one time I remember telling him, I think I think you might be kind of racist. And he was like, Black people can't be racist, because to be racist, you have to have the power. And I knew that was wrong, but I lacked the philosophical chops at probably 11 or 12 to argue with him about it. But in both of these ways, both how they were as readers and how they looked at the world, I was different from my family. I had no trouble slowing down to read, sitting for afternoons at a time, devouring hundreds of pages. I gobbled up whatever we had at home, whatever I could convince my parents to buy me from the Scholastic Book Fair, and whatever I could haul home from the library. Um, Yeah, I just had these distinct memories of like getting a blanket and sitting down on top of the heating vent that was in the floor. And so the heat would come up and billow the blanket out. And there was like this big cushion of warm air with a cup of hot cocoa and just like, reading the Chronicles of Narnia for the 10th time or whatever. And I didn't see people in terms of race, but in terms of interests and personality. People who were like me were my friends. People who weren't were not. And I'm not making an argument about whether it's good or bad to be colorblind. That's a different discussion. I'm just describing how I actually thought as a kid. After going to my first orchestra concert, my father commented that I was the only black person in the orchestra. I thought that couldn't be true and said so. He said, okay, name one other black person. And I was like, uh, well, I mean, huh. And that's when it took me a moment going through everybody face by face to realize that he was right. First thing he noticed when we took the stage, I'd been rehearsing with him for months and had never noticed it. I suppose one more thing ought to be said, and that's that my father and brother, at least, were extreme extroverts. I'm not sure about my mother. I think she fell somewhere in the middle. It was hard to tell because she was chronically sick, and so she didn't get out much. So I didn't get to see a lot of interactions with her with other people, and I didn't couldn't really judge on that basis. But I know my father and brother for sure were, they really thrived on the energy of other people and being with other people and that sort of a thing. Um, but I'm an extreme extrovert. And so that put me at odds with all of them. And there were ways in which, at the time that I was growing up, which is in the early 80s, people were not as aware of the differences between introverts and extroverts. And so it was kind of, if you were an extroverted family, then you were expected to just come on, just, get along with it. You got to get on board and do the thing. Right. And so that was another area in which I was out of step with the family culture. Well, another aspect of my cultural dysphoria was that I was growing up in the South-ish, which I would describe as an extroverted culture. People you don't know will expect you to they would greet you on the street, they talk to you in the store, and they would expect that you were excited to be making human contact, which I generally was not. I may have been guilty of occasionally using a book as a shield to protect me from the martial advances of shallow social trivialities. So I was a black sheep in my family and in my culture. I found myself longing for things I didn't know well how to put into words, on the cusp of thinking thoughts too big for my experiences, feeling keenly that I was different from those around me, while at the same time being convinced that nothing was wrong with me, that if anything was wrong with anybody, it was wrong with them. Now, this is a story you've heard probably many times before. You know how this thing goes. And it's customary at this point in the story to say, and then I found myself in books and I realized that the great thinkers of the past had the answers to the things I was feeling. And that's why I love the great books. And you know how it goes. But my story doesn't go there, at least not yet, because I still didn't know what the great books were. And I had no way of finding out. The reading lists in the school districts where I went were mostly populated with realistic coming-of-age American literature from the 1890s to the 1960s. Whatever the merits or demerits of these books, which I talk about in other places, they were not stepping stones to the classics. The characters who filled their pages, things like the Yearling, the Red Badge of Courage, White Fang, and this kind of stuff, they knew little of the great books. And so the great books were not talked about. And these books didn't have any of the breadcrumbs that I could follow up to get back to those other books. So instead, I was forced to puzzle out my humanity on my own. Always a bit confused, not to find my own immensity of soul, as I thought it, mirrored back to me by the world around me. What I was looking for was recognition. What I mean to say is that I was looking to recognize my outlook on the world in places outside of myself. I knew even then that if I were to find that, it would be an affirmation of me. I did not yet see the deeper truth that it would also be an affirmation of my humanity. But I sensed something of that truth because I knew that the world would be less lonely if I found what I was looking for. I looked for it in people and places, but above all, I looked for it in stories. I felt that I found it most frequently in movies, which were often about starting someplace unbearable and winding up someplace amazing. Especially in the 80s, this happens a lot, right? The character begins in a very normal, mundane type of situation, and then, they're the chosen one, and they learn about these magic powers they have, or they get whisked off to save the galaxy from great evil or something like that. I mean, Star Wars is a great example of this. Luke Skywalker is living in Tatooine, for goodness sake. It's like he says that there's a bright center to the universe, he lives as far from it as it's possible to be. And yet out of that place, and he farms moisture, right? Like, what is that about? He doesn't even farm water. He farms moisture, which is less than water. But he goes from there to changing the whole destiny of the galaxy. So I could get with that because I was starting in that same nowhere place, it seemed to me. And so if Luke Skywalker could stop farming moisture and become a Jedi, maybe I could stop doing whatever I was doing and become something else as well. I also found it in speculative fiction. But because most of what I was reading was pulp fiction, the seeming profundity I found there was illusory, was a mere satisfaction of my own will for power, offering me the belief that it lay within my reach, power, if I believed hard enough and kept my eyes open. These books didn't teach me how to be in the world, and they didn't teach me much about the world either. Still, I made do with what I had, trusting my heart about the nature of the world and growing up with problems, hopes, and beliefs bigger than my concepts. Things changed for me pretty dramatically when I became a Christian at age 16, because then I started reading the Bible. In it, I discovered ancient and divine wisdom, but I also began to read for the first time in a traditioned way. Now I'm reading along with, at the beginning, just the apostles, right? Reading the Old Testament the way that Paul is reading the Old Testament in the New Testament, but increasingly reading along with other Christians as well. The true gateway drug turned out to be C.S. Lewis. And this is funny because it goes all the way back. You know, C.S. Lewis is the first, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is the first book I remember loving. It's my first favorite book. Um, I don't know. I mean, I used to love Where the Wild Things Are, and I would give almost anything to re-experience the feeling of reading Where the Wild Things Are for the first time because I can't recapture it. I can't even remember it. I just know that it was amazing, and now I read it and I'm like, it's okay. But I think it was that same bit of this, you're just asleep in your bed at night, and these monsters come and take you off to an incredible place where the rules that you know of the world don't apply anymore. That may have been earlier, but I don't know for sure. But The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe got me in a way no other book had. And that's all the way back in, I think, kindergarten. They were reading it to us before nap time. It was either kindergarten or pre-K. Um, and so it's interesting that circling back around to him as a young man, as a young adult, he was also the gateway drug. As a senior in high school, I picked up Plato's Republic because Professor Kirk in Narnia had indicated that from Plato I could learn that nothing was more likely than that there be other worlds around every corner. I took the Republic with me on my college visit, reading it on the plane and in the hallway in the dorm. I must confess that I was far from seeing what the professor meant. I did not. I thought this was going to be, this deep wisdom. It was going to be like, Narnia and things, and I didn't see it. And it was a really hard read, but I was determined and I got through it. After this, there was a lull while I continued to plow through the rest of Lewis's writings. By the time I had matriculated at my university, I was getting to the dregs. Lewis's literary criticism and his diary. At that point, most of his letters had not yet been published. In such works as The Allegory of Love, which was Lewis's literary criticism, that's what he made his literary reputation on. And it's, even to this day, it remains one of the important classical works in medieval romance literature. In that book, I found lengthy discussions of books I had never heard of, and I saw lengthy passages from those books quoted in languages I didn't know. So I just had to skip those parts. When he would give an example quote, I would just have to skip over it because I couldn't read it. Actually, I didn't always skip it. Sometimes I just read it just to sound it out to try to see if I could get anything from it. But I kept on because it was Lewis, and I was fascinated by this way of talking about books. I began to get a vision for what a scholar should be, a vision that would very much influence the way I shaped my own scholarly training. Well, when the inevitable day came that turned the last page of the last book of Lewis, I experienced a deep sense of sadness and also an aporia. Whither now? I took a dive into Bonhoeffer because I had liked The Cost of Discipleship, but found that liberal Protestant theological scholarship did not scratch the same itch. I also read some George MacDonald because Lewis liked him so much, but at that age, I liked a little more linearity with my fairy adventures. As an essay that I wrote at the time, I used to just write essays just for myself, thinking that someday I'd be famous and people would publish them in books like they did Lewis's essay and when people would want to read them. Um, if that should happen, I hope they won't publish those essays. But there's an essay from that time in which I made the comment that I thought that Fantastes either has no plot, or if it does have a plot, it's beyond my power to suss out what it is. It clearly does have a plot, looking back on it now, but it was so unlike, so disconnected, and so different to other stories that I had read before that it didn't feel like it had a plot. It felt like now this is happening, now this is happening, now that's happening. I don't remember the exact day I hit on the idea, but I remember the feeling like a bolt of heaven. I was like, wait a minute, I'll read what Lewis read. He and I are basically the same person, so if he liked something, I should like it. Never mind that I had already proved that I was not the same person as he, and that I would not necessarily like what he liked by my unequal response to McDonald. Did get better about that, by the way. I love McDonald now. I had a plan, and it seemed good. And so I began reading Lewis's footnotes. And in a real sense, that's when my personal engagement with the classics began. The Aeneid, Paradise Lost, Tasso. My first reads of all of these books came about because Lewis talked about them. Right? If I saw a book discussed in Lewis anywhere, I found that book in the library and I read it. That led me to change my major to literature. And now they were coming fast and furious. All of Shakespeare in just over a semester. Comparing Marlowe and Goethe on Faust. Learning Middle English to read Havelock the Dane and Chaucer in the original. Anglo-Saxon poetry. Romanticism. As much Walter Scott as I could cram between classes. A brief tour of Gothicism. And then the Great Middle Ages, where national boundaries were forgotten and I was set free to roam over French romances, Italian epics, and the delightfully never-ending Romance of the Rose. I wept that the Fairy Queen was unfinished, because even though it's the longest poem in English, it wasn't long enough for me. I wanted more. I scratched my head over American literature, pondering the question, is there such a thing as American literature? I felt a morbid fascination in spite of myself with Thomas Pynchon. I was blown away by Statius. And now I got it. When the authors I was reading, because C.S. Lewis had read them, began quoting the other authors I had read because Lewis had read them, I could see clearly that this was a conversation. It's still really powerful to me to think about the fact that I'm reading Thomas Aquinas, who has read Boethius, whom I have also read. We've both read Boethius talking about Porphyry, whom we've both also read, and we've both read Porphyry talking about Aristotle, whom we've both also read. That Porphyry, Boethius, Thomas Aquinas, and I all have in common reading Aristotle. And the later in time you go, the more people we have in common that we've been reading together. And it's really, really powerful to think about that. When I think about Aquinas looking at the same things in Boethius that I'm seeing and coming up with this, where I came up with that, and then interacting with him about that, interacting with other people, like, say, Scotus, who interacted with Aquinas about those kinds of questions. It's really, really profound. I had achieved my goal of becoming C.S. Lewis. No, I hadn't, right? I had not achieved my goal of becoming C.S. Lewis, but I had achieved something better. I became, like him, a participant in the conversation of Western culture. Everything after that was details. Learning 10 more languages, 5 graduate degrees from Yale. That was just details. The trajectory was already set. Even if I hadn't done those things, if I hadn't learned the languages and gotten all those degrees from Yale, my house would still look like this. Because at that point, I was the kind of person who was going to read and who was going to accumulate books and keep accumulating more and more authors and more stories and experiences. More importantly, for my purposes today, I found that the vision of self and world that I had been reaching for all my life was laid out in those pages. I realized that what I had been experiencing with Lewis, namely a friendship with a man I had never known and who had died before I was born, was what was on offer in all of these texts. friendships. I kept a pretty detailed diary during a lot of college, and I lost more time than I care to admit in his pages preparing for this talk. And now I just, I'm like, when can I find more time to read some more of that? Because I'm funny. Like, I'm not necessarily trying to be funny, but I am, because I'm saying this stuff and I'm so pretentious and so full of myself. And I look at it now and I'm just like, oh, that's cute, kid. What stands out to me, though, as I read it, is the way my days move effortlessly between the fellow students with whom I was interacting and the books that I was reading. They were really just two sets of friends. And so I talked to my living friends about the things I had done with my dead friends, and I reflected on the things I had done with my living friends, along with the words and thoughts of my dead friends. There was something missing from my life, and I had no exemplars for the thing I was searching for. But it was not missing from the world. And my engagement with the world was sufficient to render me capable of the belief that the problem was not that it was nowhere to be found, only that I hadn't found it yet. You see, this is a real issue when it comes to belief. When you go into the wardrobe and you feel your way to the back of it, and you hit the back of it, and you bang on the back of it, and you beg to be let in, and you ask Aslan to let you in, and it doesn't open up and nothing happens, you've got a choice about how you think about that. You can think that proves that there's no such thing as Narnia and that you can't get to other worlds through wardrobes. Or you can think, wrong wardrobe. I've got to keep searching. I've got to find a different wardrobe. What are the conditions? What are the failure conditions for that project? When do you decide, gosh, I've been through 5 wardrobes, 10 wardrobes, 100 wardrobes. It's never going to happen. There are no other worlds. Whatever justifies you in saying, because I haven't seen it yet, I will never see it. We haven't come across it yet, therefore it cannot exist. That's turned out to be a very dangerous thought in human history, because it tends to make us really, really sure of things that aren't true. It makes it harder for us to notice things beyond the way that we look at the world already. If I had to boil it down, I would say that I was struggling for a broader understanding of what it meant to be human, and a broader understanding of what the possibilities for humans are. For I felt that my culture was providing me with a very narrow set of possibilities, and one that I did not fit into comfortably. So I could either say, this is all there is, I have to be like this, which is what everyone expected me to do. Or I could say, no, my heart tells me there's another way to be, and I don't know where it is or how to find it, but I'm not going to give up looking for it. I'm going to live as like a Narnian as I can, even if there is no Narnia. I think this must be, in some sense, the experience of everyone who resonates with the great books. The sense of needing the world to be bigger than what we can experience in everyday life, combined with the need for humanity to mean more and be capable of more than what those around us think it can be, than what we ourselves are able to express of it. The human intellect, Aristotle says, is in a certain way all things. It is all things by becoming all things via the possible intellect. The possible intellect takes on the form of whatever we're thinking about. So don't think about an elephant. Right. So now your possible intellect is in the shape of an elephant, and your intellect has become, in a sense, an elephant. Right. Now don't think about a dolphin, and now your possible intellect is in the shape of a dolphin. Thus, it can be satisfied with no one thing because it is ordered to all things. Or as Augustine puts it, and I think more truly, because he had read Aristotle, though, our hearts are restless until they find rest in God. Bonaventure, who has read both Aristotle and Augustine, glosses this by arguing that the human mind and heart can never be satisfied with anything less than infinity, because they were destined for infinity. Only an infinite object could satisfy our longing. What all 3 of these thinkers are getting at is the truth that for humans, the world is not enough. One world is not enough. But every time human genius turns the world sideways to look at it in its own new and characteristic way, a new world, as it were, is created. And so we do not have to make do with only one world, because in the thoughts of our friends, both living and dead, we have many worlds to explore. So that's what I wanted to say. that's just kind of a statement to kind of open things up. I'm very interested to know what you'd like to talk about.
That was so amazing. And I want to, especially when you did that, almost like a family tree of your reading.
Yeah.
And I'm sharing this with you all. It's a secret, but I'm gonna share it with you all. And it means it's gonna end up on the video, but that's okay. Because I had this image of this. Right now, I call it the tree of human knowledge, but I don't know if that's even right because not every people group is included in the tree. But I feel like it really illustrates what you shared. I'm going to show it to you really quick.
Hmm.
Let me see. How do I do this? I'm going to do files. Will this let me? Oh, you know what? Hold on. I'm going to do this. I want to show this to everyone just so, because I feel like it really illustrates what you're trying to say. Hold on a second. I'm going to actually pull up the, all right. So I call this the tree of human knowledge. And it makes me think of what you shared.
Mm.
If you just go through human history, we know that it kind of all began with the African civilizations. And this is not in any way trying to make one thing better than the other. I'm just showing
Mm-hmm.
how this works. And we tend to read this way. And this is actually what the great conversation is or
Mm-hmm.
should be. It's what Mortimer Adler was trying to organize. So we have
Mm-hmm.
the African civilizations, then the Middle Eastern civilizations, and then classics, which would be ancient Greece and Rome. And classics are so important, and we need to understand that because what they did, and if you read the classics authors, they actually go back and tell you about these authors that came
Yes.
before them. They
Yes.
tell you this is where we learn what we know. And
Yes.
so the classics time period is so important because somebody there, that's why I'm grateful to it, helps me know how even my ancestors have contributed to the great conversation
That's right.
because they weren't cursed by this daggone color line. You know, they didn't hide this. Herodotus didn't hide this. Plutarch has this beautiful book called Isis and Osiris.
Mm.
And it is the most beautiful story on that myth, but also about Egyptian culture.
Mm.
And so I just find this really amazing how you shared that because you went back and said, I read Boethus and I read Aristotle, and it's like, and then I felt like I was a part of this community. Going back to what
Mm-hmm.
Miss Erica shared a moment ago, I feel part of this community of readers that has
Mm-hmm.
expanded centuries.
Yeah.
And so as you can see, it builds. And so the classics then gives birth to the Western canon. And I added this bird on it, and I call the bird humanity. We are all resting and being
Mm.
nourished from this tree.
Mm.
We found our home in this tree. We found our food in this tree. We found safety in this tree. Your story expresses that, you know?
Mm. Yeah.
I just wanted to
And
share that with you all. But
if I could say something about this tree too, while you've got it, throw it back up for a second.
oh yeah, okay.
One of the things that's really fascinating about this, the way I've been thinking about this lately is, you know, for a long time, and no one taught me this. I can't blame anybody about this. This was just my assumption. When I would read the Iliad, in my imagination of the battle of the War of Troy, it was the Greeks and other people who looked like Greeks and were basically Greeks fighting each other.
Yes,
Right?
yes,
And like no
yes,
one told me that. And I read the books at the beginning where it tells you all these tribes, and I'm reading the footnotes to say where the tribes come from, but it's like a bunch of white Europeans fighting each other, speaking the same language, right? And recently, like embarrassingly recently, I realized that that's deeply wrong. I've
yes,
known for a long time that the point of the Trojan War, why this myth caught their attention so much, was because it was about which civilization is going to control the Mediterranean basin,
yeah,
right?
yep,
But I thought of it as something like the Peloponnesian War. Is it going to be Athens or Sparta? Is it going to be Greece or
yes,
Troy, right? But then I woke up to the fact that, wait a minute, Troy is the Middle Eastern civilizations. This is a passing of the guard from the Middle East to Rome, to Greece, to the Trojans
yes,
we're talking about. And then I thought, wait a minute, where else am I missing this? And it was like, oh my gosh, the Punic War is about African civilizations versus the European civilizations that have now assimilated the mantle of the Middle Eastern civilizations. And so is Africa or Europe going to
yes,
control the
yes,
Mediterranean basis? That's why Greece and Rome kept going back to these two wars, because that
yes,
was foundational. And in the same way that Rome kept talking about Greece and still in Greek culture, even though they had beat them, and you shouldn't have to do that, right? You won, guys. In the same way, both Greece and Rome kept reaching back to Middle Eastern culture and
yes,
to African culture and saying, gosh, the Africans are so smart. and they have
Yes.
all this knowledge that we don't have, and all this wisdom, and they're so much more spiritual than we are and whatnot.
Yes, yes, yes. And the thing about it that and even in that, when we say that, immediately our time period goes right into thinking race.
Mm-hmm.
But they weren't
Mm-hmm.
thinking, they were thinking this is just the human experience. These
Cultures.
cultures
Yeah. Race is
battling.
all
Yeah.
the race is based on genus. That's the same word we get Genesis in Greek. It's where you come
Mm,
from. They thought we all came from two people. Like
yes.
even the non-Jews, they all thought that. And so we're all the same race. But
Yes.
these
Wow.
cultures, which are expressed as languages, these are the things that
Yes.
separate us, and that's the stuff that we're warring over. That makes us
Yes.
in them.
Oh, that's woo.
One of the things, I'll give you a preview. What I'm going to talk about it on the in the in-person gathering on June
Yeah.
15th is I'm going to reflect on this notion of who do you identify with, right? Who do you look back to in the past to ground your story?
Mm.
Because it is a really fascinating change that happens in Western culture. It's massive, and generally it goes unremarked on by the people who made it and by the people who came after. So
Yes.
that's a teaser for June 15th.
Woo. And see, this is why you're saying these are my dead friends. I think the title of your talk really captured me because I have felt that. And you started off your talk talking about the challenge of being a person of color in this field is really hard. It's really
Mm-hmm.
hard. And I don't want to make this about race, but I just want to tell this is my human experience because in my community, I'm looked at like, what in the world are you doing? Like,
Mm-hmm.
why are you so interested in this, right? And then you have some on the other side is like this is ours, like
Mm-hmm.
you're infiltrating this to
Mm-hmm.
bring my story into the classical tradition is an intrusion on our tradition.
Mm-hmm.
When we talk about, I bring it back to the purpose of this whole movement is when we talk about redefining classics, we're not supposed to be protecting or rejecting,
Yeah.
we're supposed to be celebrating.
Yes.
It's kind of like what you said about all these years reading about the Trojan War, you just thought it was a bunch of white people fighting,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And I was like, hey, look, I was in my 40s when I've just turned 50. So it was very recent for me when I realized, wait, this is about all of us.
Yeah.
I'm here.
Yeah.
And the classical tradition is one of those few traditions. Because a lot of traditions are really about that people group.
Yeah.
The classical tradition is unique. If people would just read it, my Lord, if they would just read it, it
Mm-hmm.
really is about a lot of different people where all of us intersect. Because if
Right.
you read these authors, they are talking about all these different continents. It's Frank Snowden really breaks it down really well in his book Before Color Prejudice, because before Color Prejudice, they had no problems talking about everybody
Yeah.
and including everybody in the story.
Yeah.
There's a
And
question. I was
the
Go
Trojan
ahead.
War is ground zero of that classical tradition.
Yes,
And the
yes,
Trojan War is all about these cultures trying to figure out what are we going to do with each other. Right.
yes, yes.
Yeah.
Dr. Ronick, Michelle Ronick says, what is your view of book culture, i.e., the need for easy access to books, libraries, and even being multilingual?
I wonder if part of the question also is to do with analog versus digital.
Mm.
And if I'm going to take it that it does, and I hope that won't lead me astray. But I think physical books are really, really important.
Yes.
Um, and there's a couple of reasons. So first of all, okay, before I get to physical, let's just talk about books, and then we'll talk about physical books later. Books are essential because books allow me to go places I can't go otherwise,
Mm-hmm.
right? I mean, we live in a world where we do have the ability to fly all over the place and do all these sorts of things at an unprecedented rate in human history. Nevertheless, I haven't been to every state. I'm fairly traveled compared to the average American, and remember, like only not 1% of people in the world have ever flown in an airplane. But compared to that, I'm fairly well traveled. I've only been to about a dozen countries. There's hundreds, right? We can't go everywhere. And even if I
Mm.
could go everywhere, I can't go every when. And even if I could go every when, even if I finally break through the time machine, you can't see that's what's on the floor because of the time machine parts. But even if I finally get that thing sorted out, I can't go inside you. Get inside. I
Mm.
can't see the world through your eyes, right?
My gosh, my gosh.
So, but I've got these things here. This happens to be one of the mini books sitting by my desk. I got loads, but this
Yes,
is
me
here.
too.
And here, all of a sudden, I can understand something about being a displaced prince in medieval Denmark through the eyes of a 16th century Elizabethan playwright.
Yeah.
Right. And I'm
Yeah.
learning about both of those cultures and both of those perspectives from doing this. Um, it's more efficient than trying to travel other ways, right? And then of course, this what you see behind you, which is a small portion of my library. This is not a
Yes.
background, by the way. This is real. I can go over here. I did that at one time in a class. Someone asked if it was a background. I said no, and I went and took a book off the shelf, and he was like, "That's amazing, what they can do with technology these days."
Right.
But, you know, this just what you see on screen right here. That's probably $10,000 worth of books.
Yeah.
Easy, actually. Um, Not everyone can do that. Not everyone can do that financially. Not everyone can do that space wise. I can barely do it space wise. I've got boxes in the attic that are not out on the shelves. You know, we got
Yes.
stacks everywhere that are
Me
both on the
too.
shelves and all this. It's a whole thing, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so because of that, we need access. We need ways to get the books, ways to get the things that we can't have. I don't
Yeah.
have a book I wish I had. Not even
Yeah.
close, right? I
Yeah.
could if you give me $10,000 to spend on books right now, and that's Junius Junius Johnson with an H. I, the Lord bless you for your donation. If you were to do that, I could spend it all, you know, in a week, and I still wouldn't have everything that I want to have. So that's really important. But why does it matter, right? We've got Kindles, we've got iPhones, and we can listen to them through LibriVox and Audible and these other sorts of things. Who cares? Aren't you just being an old curmudgeon and a Luddite and saying we need this little thing here?
Yeah.
What does it matter? Well, neurologically, different parts of the brain are activated when we listen to something versus when we read something. Um,
Mm-hmm.
would you like to be able to go back and read my comments today? That is the most commonly heard thing that I say after I speak because I speak really
Yes.
fast and also because I was trained to write really densely. And so I pack a lot in,
Yeah.
right? You want to be able to go back and read because you not just because you can slow down and take your time over it, but because your brain processes information differently
Yeah.
when you read. Furthermore, when you're holding a physical thing, it is very clear to you, even if
Mm.
you're not thinking about it, it's very clear to you that you are the most recent in a chain,
Yeah.
that you are reading in a traditioned way, right? Digital things, by abstracting from the physical, abstract from the particular.
Mm-hmm.
You can think it's just this idea out there, it's
Yeah.
disembodied. This is not disembodied.
Yeah.
Somebody thought this was worth spending money on printing a whole lot of these.
Yeah.
Somebody thought was worth spending money on buying this, me or someone else, right? The way it appears on the page.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the who wrote these notes about what the words mean on the side? Where'd that
Yeah.
come from?
Yes. Yes.
So I really think that all of those things are important because it's about
Oh no. Oh no. No, I'm frozen.
frozen.
Okay.
Anyway,
Okay.
Michelle clarifies the question about paywalls and things, which also meant to say yes, you can have the classics for just $9.95 a
Yes.
month in perpetuity. Yeah, that's not good, right? I
Mm-hmm.
mean, why do you get to gate this? What
Mm-hmm.
that does is that immediately takes the group of people who don't have the money to spend on what will often be viewed as a luxury. It prevents them from taking the journey that would prove that it's not a luxury.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right? Socrates says the unexamined life is not livable for man. He said that in
Yes.
the context of being tried for capital crimes of corrupting people with his crazy ideas.
Right.
I think he's right.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so it's so we have to make sure that we provide people with the tools to live examined lives. Otherwise, we're keeping them from access to being human at some level.
Yes. And I think holding a book and having access to that book, she put another comment, and she says, what about the paywalls to electronic items, which exclude those who cannot pay to cross that particular line? And I feel like, again, the value of books where you get them from a used bookstore, a library where you have free access. I think about the many stories I've heard. I think it's Daniel Padilla when he wrote his um his article in the was it the New York Times, I think, but his exposure to classics was in a homeless shelter, in the
Mm,
homeless shelter library. I have a cousin who is in jail right now, and he
mhm.
is reading,
Yeah.
and so I feel like the physical books do they make it more accessible. And the other thing is that there is something so personal about that process of holding it,
Mm-hmm.
writing in it, highlighting
Mm-hmm.
in it, folding the pages, but like making it. yours, like a book show. Like I have two, like I'm gonna give you a good example. This is a book inspired by the classical tradition. I had to buy another copy, but Anna Julia Cooper's book, I have two copies because the first one is just all jacked up,
Yep.
And I was afraid, so I got the second one because I thought that I was going to lose pages from this one. This is relationship.
Mm-hmm.
This fact that the pages are barely hanging on and the pages are all turned back, and I got all these highlighted notes, and this is me, and this book and I have been. This is my ride or die.
Yeah.
Right. And I think, and I have the same issue, or not issue. It's the same thing with some other books I've read. I have a real relationship like that with Aristotle because I used to hate Aristotle when I first met him. Oh my gosh, I hated him so bad. Until something, right? But I think that's why you also have to read and reread because now I'm like, I tell people all the time, he's my boyfriend. Like his understanding of wonder and think, like I now understand. When I came across Heidegger, which formed the basis of my dissertation, I by that time I had already fallen in love with Aristotle, and I understood his obsession with Aristotle because the way Aristotle seems to understand the need for the mind to wonder and question. And to use the senses and to think and look at the world around you. And from that process, you learn and you engage in conversation through all of the faculties you've been given.
Yeah.
And then you write about it. Once I understood that, it was a bunch of gibberish before then, but like once I understood what he was doing, for some reason, Parts of Animals caused me to understand everything else he had written.
Interesting.
And that's relationship. We develop a relationship with these authors. I think one of the things that I have found with classics authors, especially the works of the ancient world, is they're the only books I can read over and over again. Well, I'm not gonna say only books, but they're the main books, right? That I love to read over. Like they're inexhaustible in what I learn and glean and discover through reading them.
Yeah. Yeah. And I always say any book worth reading is worth reading twice.
Yes.
If I read a book and I think I don't want to read that again, then that's not good, right? But the whole, all of this whole list thing, 100 greatest books, 10 books every person should read, this kind of stuff, it trains you to say, okay, so then you check it off, right? Now I have read the Divine Comedy and I can move on to the next thing. Books are not meant to have been read. Books are meant to be read. I remember my dissertation, my first dissertation advisor, I asked her a question about Heidegger one time because I'd read Heidegger in my senior year of college, and it's complicated with Heidegger. Like he and I are not best friends, but he's fascinating as all get out. And I really disagree with like almost everything, but I love reading him still. And I'm just like, yes, tell me more of your nonsense thoughts. And so I was, I never heard her talk about him. She was very much more in the analytic tradition, and she didn't care for that continental stuff. And so I asked her one time. I said, "What do you think about Heidegger? Like, do you think there's any benefit to bringing Heidegger into some of these conversations that we've been having?" And she says, "Oh, you should talk to so and so. He reads these guys." And I was like, "What do you mean like, haven't you read Heidegger?" And she's like, "Yeah." And I was like, "So what do you think?" And she was like, "Oh, you should talk to him. He reads these guys." And I'm thinking, what are you on about?
Right.
But then I realized it because it has happened to me where there's someone that really well, an author really well, and then someone else who has read them once will come along and they'll make a claim about what they think that's wrong.
Yeah.
And you'll say, no, that's not what Aquinas would say, for example. And they say, well, no, here it is right here. You can see him saying it right here in the Summa. Right. And you're like, yeah, he does say that there, but you have to understand what that means in the context of his whole thought. And that's what she was after, is it's not enough to just have read somebody and then start texting, right? You've got to read them well enough to understand what they mean when they say that.
It seems like you both are saying there are some who read and some who have a conversation with the author.
Right. It's like, I mean, look, I bet there are things that if you think about the people close to in your lives, your spouses, your children, your friends, whatnot, there are things that you hear them say. And you know what's up, like you get what they're on about, but you say, please don't say that to other people because someone who doesn't love you is going to misunderstand what you're saying and think that you mean this thing, right?
Yes.
You could go through all of our lives if you had a transcript of everything we said.
Yes.
And pick out something that you actually said this and use that as a proof text to prove that we're a Nazi or whatever the thing is you want to say that we are. But human persons are not the one thing that they said that one time.
Yeah.
That's not what makes a human life. You got to take a
Yeah.
broader view, right?
Yes. Yes. I thought I had another, I think I answered it. Okay, I did answer that in the chat. Well, we're
Wait,
gonna end.
why don't I make a still a point
Okay.
about Michelle's the other last bit of her first question was about
Yes.
being multilingual.
Yes.
I think that's a really important question to have.
Yes. Yes.
I love languages. I love me some languages. And of course, there's a joke, right? What do you call someone who speaks two languages? Bilingual. What do you call someone who speaks more than two languages? A polyglot. What do you call someone who speaks only one language? An American. Um, and I do think other languages are important, and there's several reasons. One of them is that oh, there's a story told by Aulus Gellius, who was a Latin writer who studied at University of Athens. It wasn't a university back then, but I just like to say it that way. He studied at Athens, which was the cool place to do your studies at the time, and he kept a notebook of either cool thoughts that he had or mostly cool things that other people around him said or that he found in books. And a lot of times the little quotes, little sections he would copy out of a book would be all that we have of that book because the rest of it didn't survive antiquity. And he tells a story of Mithridates, who was this Persian king that gave the Roman Empire fits for a rather a long time. And there's this story that Roman messengers came to him to speak with him, and they couldn't speak his language. And so he says to them through the interpreters, he says, in our culture, we say that when you speak another language, you grow another heart. And then he followed it up by saying, I have 23 hearts. Right. I really love that. It's poetic. It really expresses something true as well, right? It's not just about learning to see the world differently. It is. It's not just about learning another culture. It is. In fact, it's another way of saying the same thing, but it's also about something in you changes. I don't know that you did get another heart, but I think your heart, your soul gets bigger. It's a way of making your soul more capacious. And it that feeds your creativity and your compassion and all of that type of stuff. I'm not one of these who's going to say that if you aren't reading something in the original text, then you're just not reading it. That is false. And all it does is make people not want to read the stuff. Right? I mean, why would I bother reading the Iliad in translation after you told me I'm not really reading it? I'll just give up. Thanks. Like, thanks for saving me some time. That's not the case. But I will say the experience of reading it in English and in Greek are really different. And you get different things out of them. I'll read the Bible I'll read it in Hebrew and Greek, but I also will read it in Latin or French or something like that. And I'll read it in different English translations than I'm used to because it forces me to look at the text in different ways. And yeah, sometimes I'm going to evaluate that and say, I think that's a bad translation of what the original says. But a lot of the times it's not a bad translation and it's drawing out different things. Right. So I do think that engage. Sorry, I froze. I do think that engagement with other languages is, I won't say like it's necessary to be fully human. I mean, come on. But it's a tool that you have for understanding the world that I think it would be foolish not to avail yourself of. Oh, stop, you're muted.
This was so amazing, Junius. Such a wonderful conversation. I look forward to continuing this conversation on June 15th. Junius's video will be uploaded. As a matter of fact, I am going to leave, but you all stay. I'm hoping I can be able to leave and not close the whole thing down. And I'm going to upload what we already have just to make sure we don't lose what we already have. Because we're going to be, by this evening, we'll have so much footage. I don't want my whole computer to die and we lose everything. So it just occurred to me that I should probably do that. And in about 10 minutes, we'll be back to continue our conversation with Dr. Veronica Gutierrez. I hope I'm saying that right. And so I'll see you back in about 10 minutes, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Erica, I'm assigning you as the host while I go.